When a nun must choose between the church and a home, what does God truly want from her? This story will make you rethink everything. Stay with me and you'll hear how God turned hardship into a love worth keeping. So if you'd like to hear more heartfelt Wild West tales like this one, make sure to subscribe so I can share them with you every day. And if you're ready to ride into this story with me, give this video a like and drop the number 1 in the comments so I'll know you're in the saddle ready for the journey. And now let us return to the summer of 1879 at Green River Station in Wyoming, where a train brought forth a young nun and a story began. The Union Pacific train screeched into Green River Station that August of 1879, steam curling against the dry Wyoming sky. Sister Agnes stepped down onto the platform with a small satchel in one hand and her rosary tucked safe against her chest. The crowd shifted around her. Cowboys dusted from the trail, women in traveling shawls, miners with coal-stained boots, but none looked like the man she expected. Her habit drew stares. She had been stared at before, yet in this wilderness the weight of it felt heavier, as if faith itself were out of place. Near the hitching post, a tall rancher leaned against a bay gelding. He did not move at once, only studied her with eyes like riverstones, steady and guarded. When she drew closer, he tipped his hat. "You, Sister Agnes." His voice was low, careful. "Yes," she answered, trying to keep her tone firm, though her heart thumped. "I'm Silas O'Doyle. Father Brennan sent word you'd be coming." He helped her mount, tying her satchel behind the saddle. She noticed how his hands were calloused. His shirt sleeves rolled, the sun darkening his skin. A widower, she recalled from the letter. A man holding together land and children both. "You ride much?" he asked. "Not often." "Then best hold tight." They rode beyond the depot into open land where the sky stretched without end and the scent of sage hung sharp on the breeze. Silence rode with them. She dared not fill it. Each mile felt like another step into a life she had not asked for, but now must live. The O'Doyle place was nothing grand. A log house weathered by wind, a small barn pastures reaching into the hills. But there was a stillness that spoke of survival. 2 children burst from the doorway barefoot, their laughter breaking against the dry air. A girl with a braid down her back, no more than 9, and a boy of 6, gap-toothed and lively. Vera Van Silas called, "Come meet Sister Agnes." The girl's eyes widened, solemn and searching. "Are you going to be our new mama?" The words struck harder than Agnes expected. She forced a smile, gentle but firm. "No, child, I am a servant of God. I am here to help your father and to help you for a little while." Vera's shoulders dipped, disappointment plain. The boy frowned. Mama used to braid Vera's hair. "I can do that," Agnes offered softly. The girl studied her a moment longer, then gave a small nod as if hope had been postponed, not lost. Inside the house bore a woman's touch, now faded with time, dried herbs still hanging, worn furniture polished by years of use. But there was emptiness too, as if laughter had left and never come back. Silas showed her the small back room, a narrow bed by a single window. "You'll be comfortable here," he said. He lingered at the doorframe, his expression unreadable. She met his gaze. "You seem a good father." "I try," he answered, "but I'm better with horses than with hair ribbons." That night she knelt in her room, lamplight flickering on the plaster walls. She prayed for strength. Strength not only to serve, but to resist the stirring she already felt around this man and his children. Their need pressed on her like a hand upon the heart. She told herself she belonged to God alone. Still, when the wind rattled the shutters and she heard Vera's soft laughter in the next room, a warmth spread through her chest that felt perilously close to something else. On the high plains, faith was a lantern against the dark. Yet Agnes sensed that the true trial waiting for her here would not be storms or solitude, but the bonds of a family she was never meant to claim. It is a curious thing how quickly the smallest kindness can turn a house of silence into a place that breathes again. From the morning after her arrival, Sister Agnes slipped into the daily rhythm of the O'Doyle ranch, as though she had always been meant to. The children followed her like shadows, eager to learn, eager simply to belong to someone who looked at them with patience. Vera sat at the table, her braid neat beneath Agnes's steady hands, while Van showed off his gap-toothed grin whenever she praised his efforts to sweep the porch. Silas watched quietly from doorways or fence lines, his presence solid but restrained. He was a man used to labor and loss, a man who measured his words as carefully as he mended his fences. Yet as the days passed, Agnes noticed how his eyes softened when Vera recited her lessons, or when Van brought in eggs with both hands cupped as if they were gold. The prairie itself seemed to notice. Where once the air had felt stark, now laughter lifted from the porch. Supper carried the smell of fresh bread rather than boiled beans alone. Agnes would not admit it, not even to herself, but there were moments when she felt less like a visitor and more like the missing piece of a puzzle she had not known existed. One night, thunder rolled over the valley and the sky split with lightning. The wind howled against the shutters. Van cried out in terror, stumbling into the hallway, his little body trembling. Agnes rushed from her room and dropped to her knees, gathering him close. She began to hum a hymn, soft at first, then steadier as his sobs broke against her shoulder. From the doorway, Silas stood silent, his face half lit by the flash of the storm. He did not move, did not speak, only watched as Agnes held the boy and rocked him until his fear subsided. In that moment, a man who had buried his wife 2 winters before saw what wholeness might look like again. And the sight cut him to the quick. The storm passed, but its echo lingered. The next morning, Silas left a wildflower on the kitchen table. No words, no explanation, only the small offering laid beside Agnes's Bible. She found it before breakfast and touched the petals with trembling fingers, her chest caught between gratitude and guilt. In turn, she mended a tear in his work shirt, her needle moving with quiet precision. She told herself it was a simple act of service, but when Silas wore it the next day, she noticed he brushed his hand over the stitched place, as though it mattered more than thread. Under the cottonwoods, the children played while Silas repaired a wagon wheel. Agnes sat nearby with her book of prayers, though the words blurred each time her gaze drifted toward the man bent to his work. The sun caught in his dark hair, and she found herself whispering a plea, "Lord, guard me against temptation." Yet the temptation was not of flesh alone, it was of belonging, of being needed in a way she had not known since she first wore the habit. Do you believe love can be a gift from God in the form of a family? Share your thoughts in the comments. Weeks later, a mishap forced the truth closer. Returning from town, the wagon axle gave way. Silas cursed softly, and they began the long walk home. Vera and Van skipped ahead, chasing grasshoppers, leaving the 2 adults beneath the wide sky. For a time, they walked in silence. Then Agnes spoke, surprising herself. "I never expected this." "This," Silas asked. "This life, these children, you." He stopped beneath a cottonwood, watching her with eyes that seemed to carry both sorrow and hope. "You regret it, no?" she whispered, just surprised. The wind tugged a loose strand of her hair across her cheek, and before he could think better of it, Silas reached to tuck it back. His fingers brushed her skin, an accident, yet both froze as if it had been a vow. Agnes's heart pounded. "I am vowed to God," she murmured. Silas swallowed hard, his voice low. "Then know this, since you came, I've spoken to him more than in all the years before. Maybe he sent you not just for the children, but for me too." She turned away, her pulse racing, torn between heaven and earth. His words clung to her long after they reached the ranch. That night she prayed longer than ever, yet no prayer could untangle the warmth his touch had left behind. Some words once spoken refused to fade. Silas's quiet confession beneath the cottonwood had settled in Sister Agnes's heart like a seed, small but impossible to ignore. Days passed with the same chores, the same laughter of children, but Agnes carried his words with her, heavy as a stone and tender as a promise. At night, when she knelt by the narrow bed, she tried to pray them away, yet in the silence she heard his voice again. "Maybe he sent you, not just for the children, but for me too." It was in early October when the letter arrived. The postwriter handed it to Silas in town, and he passed it to Agnes without ceremony. The seal bore the mark of the bishop. Her hands trembled before she even broke it open. "My child," the letter began, "a new convent is being established farther east. Your obedience is required. Present yourself before winter closes the passes. The words blurred. Her time here was meant to end. She was being called away from the ranch, from the children, from the fragile rhythm of life that had begun to feel like belonging. She folded the letter slowly, pressing it to her lips in silent anguish. That evening, Vera overheard her speaking to Silas in hushed tones about leaving. The girl's face blanched. She burst into tears, running to Agnes, clutching her skirt. "God doesn't want you to go," Vera sobbed. "He wants you to stay here with us. We need you." Agnes knelt, trying to soothe her. "My child, I must follow the bishop's call. It is God's will." But the girl's words clung to her like burrs. "God wants you to stay. Innocence can carry a wisdom no sermon dares speak." And in Vera's plea, Agnes heard a question that shook her. Could love itself be a holy calling? Later that week, Silas saddled the horses and rode with her to the ridge above the valley. The air was crisp, the hills washed in autumn gold. They dismounted, standing side by side in silence until Silas reached into his coat. From his pocket he drew a small wooden cross, hand-carved, the edges smooth but imperfect. "I made this for you," he said, voice rough. "I know you belong to God, but I wanted you to have something of mine. You brought life back to this place, Agnes. I'll never forget that." She stared at the cross in her palm, the weight of it almost unbearable. "Silas." He shook his head. "I'm not asking you to choose me. I just want you to know I'm grateful. Whatever happens when you leave, you changed us." It was not a declaration, it was a farewell. That night, Agnes could not sleep. She sat by her lamp, the carved cross on the table beside her, and wrestled with the shadows of her own soul. She prayed until her voice cracked, asking God for clarity, for strength, for release from this torment. But no answer came. Her mind wandered to Van's small hands clutching her habit during storms, to Vera's laughter. When the bread rose well, to Silas's steady gaze beneath the cottonwood. Could these too be God's gifts? Was it possible her vows were not meant to chain her, but to guide her toward love where it was most needed? Agnes pressed the cross to her chest. She wept not in despair, but in a breaking open of something long locked inside. For the first time she allowed herself to ask, what if God is calling me not away from them, but deeper into their lives? When dawn crept pale across the valley, she was still awake. Her eyes were red, her body weary, but her heart carried a strange, trembling hope. The path ahead was unclear, but one truth had begun to root itself. Faith could not be contained only in cloisters and stone walls. Sometimes it was forged in kitchens warm with children's laughter and in the quiet unspoken bond of two souls who had both known loss. If you want to know whether Sister Agnes will choose faith or love, hit like so I can tell you the rest. Some nights leave a soul ragged, but the morning light brings with it the courage to act. After the long hours of prayer and tears, Sister Agnes rose from her bed knowing she could no longer remain divided. She found Silas in the yard splitting wood, his breath visible in the cold air. For a moment she only watched the steady swing of his axe, the sure placement of his boots, the kind of strength that steadied more than fences. When he noticed her, he wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve. "You're up early. I couldn't sleep." Her voice trembled, but she did not falter. "I've written to the bishop. I've asked to be released from my vows." The axe slipped from his fingers, sinking into the earth. He stared at her as though he hadn't heard right. You'd do that." She touched the edge of her veil, then drew it back from her hair. "I have served God as best I know how, but perhaps he is asking me now to serve in a different way, here, with you, with the children." Silas did not rush toward her. He only stood still, as if afraid the moment would shatter if he moved. Finally, his voice came low, almost reverent. "I don't know what I prayed for last winter, but I reckon this is the answer." The weeks that followed were full of waiting. The letter to the bishop traveled east, carried by a rider whose pace no prayer could quicken. Agnes lived each day in a hush of anticipation, her heart balanced between hope and dread. Yet within the waiting something changed. The tension that once wrapped her chest eased as though the decision itself had freed her. She still prayed each night, but no longer against temptation. Instead, she prayed for patience, for strength to walk the road she had chosen wherever it led. The children noticed too. Vera no longer asked if Agnes would leave. Instead, she brought her drawings to the table and pressed against her side as she worked. Van clung to her skirts with open certainty, as though he sensed she was no longer a guest, but part of their story. One evening, when the chores were done and the lamps were lit, Silas joined her at the hearth. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching the fire crackle. "You sure you won't regret it?" he asked quietly. Agnes lifted her eyes to him. "I've lived with regret before. This feels like grace." They said little more, but when she rose to leave, Silas reached out and caught her hand. He did not press, did not pull her closer. He only held her fingers roughened by work against his chest. She felt the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm, and for the first time she allowed herself to rest in the truth of it. At last the reply came. The bishop's handwriting was firm, the words brief. He granted her release not with reproach, but with blessing. "Go where God has planted you," the letter read. "Tend the soil he has given you, and let your life be the prayer." Agnes pressed the letter to her lips, tears sliding down her cheeks. She carried it to the porch where Silas stood with the children. Without words, she placed it in his hands. He read, then looked up at her with eyes that burned brighter than any fire. That Sunday, they climbed the hill behind the ranch. Beneath the wide Wyoming sky, under an oak scarred by lightning but still standing, they spoke their vows. No preacher, no congregation, only Vera and Van holding hands, their faces solemn with joy. Silas vowed to keep her safe, never asking her to be smaller than she was. Agnes vowed to walk beside him all her days, to let their love itself be a prayer. And when the children shouted forever into the wind, she believed it with all her soul. If this part of the story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next tales. Some vows are spoken once beneath the open sky, but they echo across the years like a hymn that never fades. After that simple ceremony on the hill, life at the O'Doyle Ranch shifted not with sudden fireworks, but with a deep and steady glow. Agnes, no longer sister, but simply Agnes, woke each morning before the children stirred the fire and brewed coffee, while Silas came in from the barn with snow in his beard or dust on his coat. It was not grand romance that defined them, but the daily tenderness of two souls who had chosen to bind their lives together. Winter passed. The spring thaw came with a rush of water down the gullies, and the meadows blushed green again. Agnes planted flowers by the porch, bright patches of color against the rough-hewn logs. Vera pressed violets between the pages of her primer, while Van buried his lost teeth beside the steps so they would grow into something useful. Silas only shook his head and laughed, a sound so rare in the early days that Agnes treasured every note. The barn loft became a place of wonder. With the printing press Silas had bartered for, Agnes began teaching Vera her letters in earnest. The girl's small hands grew black with ink, her first attempts backwards and crooked, but her laughter filled the space with music. Van, too small to reach, sat on a hay bale and recited psalms while his sister worked. Agnes guided them patiently, her heart swelling with each word, each line pressed onto paper like a prayer captured in ink. At night, when the children slept, Silas would sometimes read aloud the short verses he scribbled in pencil on scraps of paper, plain words about boots on pine floors, or the hush of snowfall, or the way Agnes's laughter had softened the house. She would print them carefully, hand him the page, still damp with ink, and he would tuck it away like a treasure. Neither spoke of publishing, yet the words began to stack into a quiet testament of the life they were building. Years gathered one upon the other. Vera grew into a teacher, her love of books and printing blossoming into lessons she gave to children in the valley. Van grew strong and steady, working the ranch beside his father, but always with a storyteller's spark he had inherited from the evenings by the hearth. The O'Doyle place became known not just for its sturdy fences and fat cattle, but for the way its gates never seemed to stick. For the smell of ink on the breeze, for the welcome that met every rider who came up the lane. Neighbors said the house never felt hard like the rest of the frontier. Some claimed it was Agnes's hand, others Silas's steady character. The truth, of course, was both two lives mended together like torn cloth stitched by a patient seamstress. And through it all, the small wooden cross Silas had carved before her decision remained on the mantel, polished by years of touch. It stood not as a symbol of what she had abandoned, but of what she had chosen to serve God through the raising of children, through the tending of land, through the quiet devotion of love itself. In the evenings of their later years, when grandchildren tumbled through the yard and the hills turned gold in the long light, Agnes and Silas would sit on the porch wrapped in a quilt. She would rest her hand in his, and he would hold it without words, the steady beat of his heart the same as it had been on that morning when she first placed her palm against his chest. "Do you ever wonder where you might have ended up?" She asked him once if I had boarded the train east instead. He smiled slow and sure. "I would have lasted, but I wouldn't have lived." The moon rose full and calm over the Wyoming hills. Agnes leaned against him, whispering, "I used to think love was a thing I couldn't hold." "You're holding it now," he answered, and she did not let go. Love is not always found in cloisters or lofty cathedrals, but in the simple acts of care that bind lives together. Agnes's journey shows that God's call can lead us beyond vows of solitude into the sacred work of family healing and belonging. The true message of the Lord is that love, when given freely and without demand, becomes prayer itself. In choosing love, Agnes did not abandon faith, she discovered its deepest purpose. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Give me a like and subscribe so we can keep sharing stories full of faith and love.